Buddhist science is a study on Buddhism based on facts and science.
No self versus emptiness. Venerable Rungruan Papartsaro. Dr. Rungruan Lim Chu Pataba. In Buddhism, there are several terms and interpretations that share a similar meaning of no self, such as the nature, the law of cause and effect in nature, no self, emptiness, and element. All these words are somehow related to each other, and sometimes they are interchangeable in several contexts. The meaning of no self is very abstract and difficult for ordinary people to understand, because most of the people may interpret it as self-denying of the being of anything in the world as emptiness. Typically, when saying no self, it refers to the reality or the characteristic of every phenomenon in the world, and for the emptiness, it refers to a perception of emptiness by which, when receiving any stimulus from the world, we can perceive that they are empty so that the mind will not engage with the world. The emptiness also can be referred to the result of the state of mind when responding to a stimulus from the world with the understanding of no self, and then releasing the object of consciousness, and then the mind becomes sort of to be emptiness. By having a perception to the world as an empty of self and an empty of what belongs to self, not emptiness, it is an alternative approach guiding the mind not to cling on anything in the world. Having a right understanding that the world is no self, then it is a cause that has an effect to the mind to be emptiness. Both no self and emptiness are two sides of the same coin, depending on what we are looking at. Having a perception of emptiness is considered as a shortcut approach to liberate the mind, bypassing the study on the process of dependent origination. However, the Buddha would suggest to those who were in a special condition like being old, or getting a serious sickness. The Buddha did not broadly use this approach because it may lead to misunderstand that everything, and the world are emptiness. Therefore, in order to avoid any confusion, we should use the words an empty of self, which is the same as no self, for clarification. In Buddhism, when saying an emptiness, it should be understood in a complete meaning of an empty of self to avoid the misinterpretation of the meaning of emptiness. The emptiness is sort of a perception of an empty of self. The Venerable Ananda asked the Buddha about the empty of the world as follows.
Venerable Sir, it is said, empty is the world, empty is the world. In what way, Venerable Sir, is it said, empty is the world?
It is, because it is empty of self and of what belongs to self that it is said, empty is the world. And what is empty of self and of what belongs to self? The eye is empty of self and of what belongs to self. Forms are empty of self and of what belongs to self. Eye consciousness is empty of self and of what belongs to self. Eye contact is empty of self and of what belongs to self. Whatever feeling arises with mind contact as condition, whether pleasant or painful or neither painful nor pleasant, that too is empty of self and of what belongs to self. It is because it is empty of self and of what belongs to self that it is said, empty is the world.
The meaning of emptiness in Buddhism is similar to the word no self, and in order to avoid any misunderstanding from the original context of meaning, we should precisely call it an empty of self. In one occasion, the Buddha suggested the use of 10 perceptions and contemplations with mindfulness in coping with the world in Kairimanatta Sutta, that we could apply an emptiness perception to deal with the world so that we could release the object of consciousness. And in another occasion, as described in the Doctrine of the 16 Scholars questioning to the Buddha, when the last scholar asking the Buddha that he was quite an old person, so could the Buddha give him a shortcut way to practice, and the Buddha suggested him to have an emptiness perception to see that everything in the world was emptiness, so that when receiving anything from the world, then he could dispassionate the world, and then the mind would be liberated. The emptiness perception is very useful in Buddhist practice, but we should be careful not to mislead an empty of self to be the meaning of non-existence of everything in the world, or a life is non-existence, as the Buddha warned in the following story. In an occasion, there is a monk proclaiming that life is empty, that is, body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness do not exist. And immediately the Buddha warned him that those statements were not correct. The Buddha never said so. In fact, as long as there are still the causes of body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, then they exist alive. In Buddhism there is always a cause that makes an effect. If there is a cause, then there is an arising a body as an effect, then when there is a cause contacting to the body, then there is a feeling as an effect, similarly to this ration, then arising a perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Therefore, as long as there are cause and effect, then the body, the feeling, the perception, the mental formations, and the consciousness are arising and fading away in nature, but it does not mean that they are empty or non-existence in the world. When looking into a universe, we may see most of the space is covered with darkness, then we assume a perception of emptiness in the universe. However, the reality is that there are the areas of so much intense densities of matters and energies that even light is absorbed into those areas, so-called dark matter and dark energy. On the contrary, what we think of being an emptiness, in reality there are high densities of matters and energy in everywhere. When seeing an empty space, we may think that it is empty. But in fact, there are tremendous numbers of neutrinos and energy passing through that space. Even in among the space of subparticles, there is a transition of energy in between them. Therefore, it is only a perception that we assume an emptiness. They are empty because there is no light from them, and we cannot see them. Seeing nothing, and feeling nothing do not mean that it is an absolute emptiness. But in reality, there are matters and energy in everywhere in the world and universe. In Buddhism, the comparison of no self and emptiness can be exemplified by when having a problem, we can ignore that there is a problem or study into the problem to resolve the problem rightly. And this is the reason why in the principle of the Four Noble Truths, we start with knowing the problem clearly first, then finding the root cause of the problem before resolving the problem with the Noble Eightfold Path. However, we can utilize a perception of empty of self to manage to subdue the feelings, such as, when there is a pain causing a feeling of suffering. Then, if we have a perception of emptiness, the suffering may be lessened, but the pain still exists until taking a medicine to kill the pain. Similarly, when we feel happiness, this happiness feeling is arisen by certain stimulus, and when the stimulus is fading away, then the happiness feeling is also fading away too. Therefore, the perception of emptiness can only temporarily avoid the suffering but cannot permanently cease the suffering. The Buddha also suggested that during having a consciousness, then by having a perception that everything was an empty of self, this would be helpful in releasing the arising object of consciousness from clinging as well. In conclusion, in Buddhist practice we have a mindfulness observation on the reality of the world, that everything and every phenomenon in the world are impermanent, deteriorating and no self or empty of self.